Imagine a world so hostile that every tree drips venom. Every creature hunts without mercy, and even the air itself seems to reject human life. This was the planet no one wanted, a death world where entire colonies had failed before. Yet, against all odds, one human refused to give up. Instead of weapons, they planted a garden. And what happened next changed everything. When humans first looked at the planet, they called it a curse. It was beautiful from orbit, with blue rivers winding through endless forests and a sky so clear it almost looked welcoming. But the truth revealed itself the moment explorers stepped onto its soil. The air was sharp and filled with strange spores that stung the lungs. The trees released toxic sap that burned through skin and metal alike. Even the flowers were deadly, their bright petals hiding razor-thin thorns and venomous pollen. Every creature seemed built for survival at the expense of anything else: fangs longer than knives, claws harder than steel, and eyes that glowed in the dark. The first colonists came with hope. They believed technology would protect them. They built domes, purified air, and carried weapons powerful enough to destroy mountains. But within months, sickness spread, machines broke down, and defenses crumbled. The planet was patient, and it tested them every single day. Storms ripped apart their shelters, rivers carried poison into their crops, and predators learned to stalk their every movement. One by one, the colonies fell. Survivors were evacuated, and governments marked the planet as unfit for life. It became known as a death world, an unforgiving place that rejected human presence entirely. Yet not everyone agreed. Among the rejected colonists was a single human who looked at the ruins not with fear, but with determination. Where others saw endless death, this human saw a challenge. Soil was dangerous, yes, but beneath its poison lay nutrients waiting to be unlocked. The rivers carried toxins, but they also carried water, the essence of life. Even the dangerous plants hinted at something more, something untamed but not impossible to work with.
Oh.
While governments abandoned the world, this human decided to stay behind. The choice shocked everyone. To remain on a death world was madness, they said. Survival was impossible. Yet the humans smiled and carried only simple tools: seeds, soil filters, and a stubborn belief that life could grow anywhere if given a chance. They did not build weapons or bunkers. They did not create machines to fight the environment. Instead, they dug into the ground with their bare hands and planted the first seed. At first, nothing happened. The toxic soil seemed to laugh at the attempt. Days passed with no green shoots, only cracked dirt and dangerous winds. Predators circled in the night, watching from the shadows, but the human did not leave. Every sunrise, they returned to the same patch of ground, caring for it as if it were a child. They purified water drop by drop, added minerals, and shielded the earth with makeshift covers. The work was slow, painful, and lonely, yet hope remained. Because this human believed something the rest of the galaxy had forgotten. Gardens were more powerful than guns. Life could find a way, even in the harshest corner of the universe. And on this world that rejected colonists, the human was about to prove it. The first green sprout appeared on the 32nd day. It was small, fragile, and trembling in the poisonous wind, but it was alive. To anyone else, it might have looked insignificant, just a weak stem pushing through hostile soil. But to the human, it was a victory greater than any battle. They knelt beside it, hands shaking with relief, and whispered, "You belong here. We both do." The sprout was not just a plant, it was a declaration of defiance. In a world where entire colonies had failed, where armored ships and energy weapons had been torn apart by storms and predators, a single seed had chosen to fight back with life. The human tended to it like it was the most precious treasure in the universe. They built a shield of stones to block the harsh winds, filtered more water, and added nutrient-rich soil brought from their tiny supply. Slowly, the sprout grew stronger.
Oh.
The predators watched with hungry eyes. Strange scaled beasts circled the garden at night, their bodies glowing faintly under the moons. Their claws scraped against the human's barriers, testing for weaknesses. But the human did not fight them with bullets or fire. Instead, they built light traps, creating barriers of brightness that kept the creatures away. Fire frightened them, but light confused them, and in that confusion, the garden survived. The human learned quickly. They realized the planet was not truly rejecting life, It was rejecting weakness. The native plants were fierce competitors, fighting tooth and claw for survival. So, the human decided to adapt, began crossbreeding the Earth's seeds with fragments of local flora. The work was dangerous. One wrong touch, and the human's skin burned or blistered. But patience paid off. Soon, new hybrid plants began to rise, plants that could withstand the poisoned air, plants that could drink the tainted water without dying. Weeks turned into months. The single sprout became a cluster of green, then a patch of vibrant growth in the middle of endless wilderness. Flowers opened their petals, bright and defiant against the gloom. Vines climbed over the ruins of broken colony shelters, reclaiming them with new life. The human walked through the garden each morning, breathing in air that was just a little cleaner, a little fresher, thanks to the plants they had grown. But the world did not give up easily. Storms still raged. Poison clouds still rolled across the horizon. Predators still tested the edges of the human's defenses. Each challenge was another reminder. The garden was a fragile miracle, and yet each challenge made it stronger. Roots dug deeper, leaves toughened against toxins. Life adapted in ways even humans did not expect. News spread across the galaxy. Traders, explorers, and outcasts whispered about the mad gardener who had survived where armies had failed. Some called the human foolish, others called them brave. But none could ignore the truth. On a planet that killed everything, a garden now bloomed. And that garden was only the beginning. The garden grew, and with it, something unexpected began to happen. The hostile wilderness, which had always seemed eager to crush anything foreign, started to shift. Around the edges of the human's small sanctuary, the soil softened. Where once only poison weeds had thrived, now patches of harmless moss began to spread. Birds, strange, sharp-beaked creatures with wings like jagged blades, started to circle above, not to attack, but to perch in the branches of the new trees. Their shrill cries no longer sounded like threats, but like songs echoing across the valley. The human noticed it first when one of the native plants, infamous for its corrosive sap, bent toward the garden instead of away from it. Its thorny vines wrapped gently around a hybrid tree, and instead of killing it, the two plants seemed to share strength. The toxins weakened, diluted by the hybrid's roots, while the vine's leaves shaded the smaller sprouts from the burning sun. It was as if the world itself was learning a new way to exist. The predators noticed too. At night, their glowing eyes still ringed the clearing, but their growls became hesitant. A scaled beast crept closer than ever before, only to stop at the edge of the flowers. It sniffed the air, let out a low rumble, and slinked back into the dark. The human realized that, for the first time, the predators were not simply hunting, they were curious. They sensed the change, though they did not yet understand it. Life has a way of calling to life, and the garden was calling. The human worked harder, expanding the sanctuary. They built irrigation lines carved from broken colony pipes, directing purified water to new areas. They planted rows of food crops, hybrids tough enough to survive the poisoned ground. Carrots, beans, and leafy greens slowly filled the air with scents long forgotten in this world. The human wept the day they took their first bite of fresh food, grown entirely from the Deathworld soil. It tasted of hope, crisp and alive. But survival brought responsibility. The human knew that the garden was no longer just for them. It was becoming a refuge. Birds nested in its branches, small mammals crept in at dawn to nibble fallen seeds, and even insects began to buzz between flowers, carrying pollen from one strange hybrid to another. A new ecosystem was taking root, built from both Earth and alien life, bound together in fragile harmony. Still, whispers of doubt spread beyond the planet. Colonists who had once fled shook their heads at the rumors. It won't last, they said. The Deathworld always wins. Yet others felt a pull. Merchants passing by the system began to drop supply seeds, tools, scraps of metal, leaving them at the edge of the atmosphere like offerings to a legend. The story of the gardener was becoming something more than a tale of survival. It was a spark of possibility. The human knew one truth above all. The garden was alive, and life once begun could not be silenced. The Deathworld was not about to surrender easily. For months, the human's garden had grown in peace, But peace on this planet was always temporary. Dark clouds began to gather on the horizon, black and heavy like a curtain falling across the sky. The winds sharpened, howling through the jagged cliffs, carrying with them a chemical sting that made the eyes water and the skin itch. Old records from the first colonists had warned of these storms' tempests, so violent that they stripped paint from metal and left entire settlements in ruins. The humans prepared as best as they could. They built stone walls around the most fragile plants, covered rows of crops with sheets of salvaged colony glass, and dug trenches to catch the rivers of poisoned rain that would soon flood the valley. Still, deep inside, they feared it would not be enough. The Deathworld had crushed armies. What chance did a garden have? The storm arrived at dusk. The first bolt of lightning cracked the sky in two, striking so close that the ground shook beneath the humans' feet. Thunder roared like the growl of a titan, and then the rain came not drops, but sheets of burning water, acidic and furious. The humans sprinted through the garden, hands raw, moving from plant to plant. They reinforced barriers, patched holes, and whispered to each sprout as though words alone could shield them. Hours stretched into an endless battle. The wind ripped leaves from branches, the soil turned into black sludge, and the predators of the night howled in fear from the forests beyond. Even if they avoided the storm, leaving the human to face it alone. Lightning lit the valley in blinding flashes, revealing a lone figure hunched against the fury of the world, refusing to abandon their fragile sanctuary. By dawn, the storm passed. The sky cleared, and silence fell over the shattered land. The garden was battered, broken in places, but not destroyed. Some plants had withered, their leaves burned away, but others had endured. The hybrids, stronger than their Earth ancestors, had bent but not broken. Their roots gripped the soil tightly, holding fast through the chaos. In the ruins of the storm, green shoots still glistened with life. The human collapsed to the ground, soaked and exhausted but smiling. The storm had been a test, a trial by fire and acid, and the garden had survived. More than that, something extraordinary had happened. The poisoned rivers that once flowed deadly and dark were now slightly cleaner. The storm had carried away some of the toxins, leaving behind water that, while still dangerous, was less hostile. The hybrid plants had filtered much of it through their roots, slowly changing the very soil they grew in. For the first time, the planet had not just tolerated the garden, it had shifted because of it. When the humans stood again, they looked out over the valley with new eyes. The Deathworld would not stop trying to destroy them. But the garden had proven it could resist, and resistance was enough. It meant the impossible dream was no longer impossible. It meant they could win. The storm left scars across the valley, but it also left a message. The human realized that survival on this Deathworld was not about overpowering nature, it was about adapting to it. The garden had done just that. Where others saw ruin, the humans saw resilience. Hybrids were tougher now, their roots deeper, their leaves stronger. They were no longer just plants, they were soldiers in a quiet war against the planet itself. But the human was not the only one watching. From the edges of the wilderness, predators gathered again. Their glowing eyes reflected the new dawn, unblinking, calculating. Before, they had circled hungrily, waiting for weakness. Now, they lingered longer, not in hunger, but in something stranger curiosity. They could smell the garden, its scents unlike anything their world had known. They could hear the strange buzz of new insects, the flutter of birds that had returned to the valley. Life was reshaping itself, and even the predators sensed it. The human knew the danger. Predators this large could destroy the garden in moments if they wished. Yet, they did not charge. They kept their distance, testing the boundary, but never crossing it. One night, the humans stood at the edge of the garden with nothing but a lantern in hand. Across the field of flowers, a beast, twice their size, stepped into the open. Its muscles rippled beneath armored scales, and its teeth gleamed like knives. The human's heart pounded, but they did not run. Instead, they raised the lantern high. The storm winds whispered through the valley, and the garden swayed gently behind the human's back. Then, to their astonishment, the beast turned away. It lumbered back into the darkness, leaving only deep tracks in the soil as proof it had been there at all. The human understood something then. The garden was no longer just a project. It had become a force. Life attracts life, and even death-bound predators could not resist the pull of something new. Word spread beyond the wilderness. Traders who orbited the planet sent drones to record images of the growing oasis. The footage showed bright fields of green in the middle of endless brown and gray wastelands. The galaxy watched, amazed. Colonies that had once failed here were nothing but ruins, yet a single person with a handful of seeds had succeeded where governments had not. Still, whispers grew louder. Some wanted to study the garden. Others wanted to claim it. Rumors reached corporations eager to exploit the Deathworld's resources. And if one human could achieve this, what could thousands do with machines and funding? But the human was not thinking of profit. Standing in the garden, they thought of survival, of beauty, of the stubborn truth that life could flourish even in places meant for death. The predators were watching.
Oh.
The galaxy was watching. And the garden was just beginning to bloom. The garden had survived storms and predators, but the greatest change came quietly, almost unnoticed. For months, the human had planted seed after seed, never knowing which would live and which would wither. Some died within hours, consumed by the poisonous soil. Others struggled for days before collapsing under the burning winds. But now and then, a seed adapted. It pushed through the dirt, grew strong, and claimed its place in the world. Those survivors became the foundation of something new. The hybrids no longer looked like earth plants, nor did they look entirely alien. There was something in between sturdy leaves that resisted toxins, roots that filtered poison, flowers that glowed faintly at night, feeding on the strange energies in the soil. What had once been a barren valley was now glowing with soft light when the moons rose. The human would sit among the flowers at night, breathing air that was fresher than it had ever been, and feel as if they were sitting inside a living dream. Each new success gave humans the courage to expand. It carried seeds farther from the original garden, testing new ground. Slowly, patches of green spread outward, connected by winding paths of moss and vines. From orbit, the planet still looked hostile and broken. But in one valley, a spark of color was growing brighter every week. The garden also gave humans something no technology ever had: hope. When they bit into fresh fruit for the first time estrange. Violet-colored hybrid melon that tasted sweet despite its rough skin, they cried, not because they were hungry, but because it was proof. Proof that life could not only survive here, but thrive. And hope is contagious. Signals traveled fast through the galaxy. Stories of the gardener reached distant stations and forgotten colonies. Refugees whispered about it on crowded ships, scientists argued about it in research labs, and leaders debated whether to ignore, study, or seize it. To some, it was a miracle. To others, it was a challenge to their pride. After all, entire governments had declared the planet impossible, yet one person with nothing but seeds had succeeded. Supplies began arriving more deliberately. At first, traders had left scraps of metal and old seeds out of pity. Now, packages arrived with care tools designed for hostile worlds. Purified water capsules, even handwritten notes of encouragement. For the garden, one message read. For all of us, said another. The human read those notes at night by lantern light, holding them carefully as if they were treasures. They realized that the garden was no longer just theirs, it had become a symbol. People across the stars, beaten down by wars, poverty, or exile, looked to the Deathworld and saw something extraordinary. A reason to believe again. The garden was more than plants. It was defiance against despair. It was proof that, even in the harshest soil, seeds of hope could grow. And the human knew, deep inside, that this was only the beginning. The human often walked beyond the edges of the garden, into the ruins of the old colonies. Broken domes lay half buried in dust, their glass shattered, their steel frames twisted by storms. Rusted machines lay silent, reminders of the people who had once tried and failed to tame the Deathworld. To most, these ruins were graves' evidence that survival here was impossible. But to the gardener, they were warnings and lessons. Every collapsed wall told a story of arrogance. Colonists had believed they could bend the planet with brute force, shielding themselves in domes, relying on weapons, trying to erase the danger instead of respecting it. They had fought against the world, and the world had crushed them. The human understood now. Survival did not come from conquering, It came from listening, from finding balance. In one shattered control station, the human found records left behind. Data logs spoke of failed crops, endless repairs, and final desperate messages begging for evacuation. Some of the last entries were heartbreaking. We tried everything. Nothing grows. The planet rejects us. The human read those words and smiled sadly, because in their hands, they carried proof that the planet had not rejected them, not completely. And it had rejected weakness, yes, but it had also offered opportunity to those stubborn enough to try again. Each time they returned to the ruins, the humans carried seeds, scattered them among broken corridors, planted vines in the cracks of old steel, and placed glowing flowers on top of collapsed shelters. Slowly, life began to reclaim what death had left behind. The ruins no longer looked like graves. They became monuments of transformation. The predators noticed these changes too. At night, their glowing eyes often gathered near the ruins, watching silently. The human realized that even these beasts were drawn to the echoes of life. Sometimes they caught sight of smaller creatures trailing behind the larger ones, scavengers that had begun to settle near the edges of the garden. For the first time, a food chain was reforming in places long thought dead. But the ruins carried another kind of echo as well, voices from beyond the stars. The human knew it was only a matter of time before outsiders came again, not just traders leaving gifts, but governments, corporations, and perhaps even armies. They would see the garden not as a miracle, but as a resource. Something to control. Something to own. Humans often wondered what they would do when that day came. The garden was fragile, yes, but it was also powerful in its own way, not through weapons or fortresses, but through the undeniable truth it represented. Life endures. If outsiders came to claim it, they would not be taking just plants. They would be stealing hope. And hope once planted does not die easily. So the human kept planting, kept expanding, letting the garden grow into the ruins of the past, because they knew one thing with certainty. The best way to honor those who had failed was not to mourn them, but to show that their struggle had not been in vain. The ruins whispered of failure. The garden answered with life. The Deathworld had no words, but it spoke in storms, in winds, in the endless struggle of life clawing its way through poisoned soil. At first, the human thought they were fighting against that language. But over time, as the garden grew, they began to realize something unexpected. The garden itself was learning to speak back. It began with the roots. The hybrids stretched beneath the ground, weaving into the soil like veins. They filtered poisons, released oxygen, and reached out toward each other. In the silence of the earth, they shared strength. When one plant struggled, its roots intertwined with another's, borrowing nutrients. When toxins swept through, they spread the damage, so no single sprout carried it alone. The human noticed this. When a row of vines that should have died in the poisoned rain continued to live fed by the strength of deeper, stronger roots nearby. Above the soil, the plants responded to predators in ways that seemed impossible. When the scaled beasts circled too close, the glowing flowers brightened suddenly, pulsing in unison like warning signals. The predators paused, uneasy, as if they understood the message. "We see you." The human marveled at this living network. It was more than survival, it was communication. A language written not in sound, but in growth, color, and adaptation. The garden was teaching the Deathworld a new dialect, one built on cooperation instead of endless destruction. The human adapted to. They learned when to step back and when to intervene. Instead of forcing order, they guided gently, placing stones to redirect water. Scattering seeds where sunlight fell naturally, watching which hybrids thrived and which failed. It was not about control, it was about trust. Nights in the garden grew quieter. Once toxic winds now carried the faint sweetness of flowers. Insects buzzed lazily between glowing blossoms. The human would sit in the center, lantern dim, listening to the soft hum of life around them. In those moments, they realized something profound. The Deathworld was not rejecting them anymore. It was listening. Beyond the valley, the wilderness was changing too. Moss spread along the edges of cliffs. Birds nested closer each season. Even the predators seemed less restless, circling without attacking. The balance was shifting. The planet, once known only for death, was beginning to accept life's stubborn intrusion. But the human knew balance was fragile. The language of roots could not be rushed, and it could not be shouted over with machines or weapons. If outsiders returned with greed in their eyes, they would break everything. The garden was not strong enough to resist conquest. Not yet. And so each day the human planted more. It's not just for food, not just for survival, but as a message written in living green. Life belongs here. Now, we belong here. The Deathworld had spoken for centuries with death. Now for the first time, it was learning to answer with life. The day began like any other. Human was kneeling in the soil, their hands dark with dirt, planting another row of hybrid seeds. The garden stretched wide knowers of food crops, glowing flowers, and creeping vines reclaiming the ruins. The air was fresher than ever, carrying the faint sweetness of new life. But then a shadow passed overhead, long and deliberate. The human looked up, and their heart froze. The ship. It was not a trader's drone, not a passing freighter. This was larger, heavier, with markings the human recognized from old colony records. A government vessel. For years, officials had ignored the Deathworld, writing it off as a failure, an endless grave. But now they had returned, and they were coming for the garden. The ship landed on the cracked plateau above the valley. Its engines roared, sending dust and sparks across the cliffs. The human watched silently as figures in heavy suits descended, their visors shining in the harsh sunlight. Soldiers, scientists, officials. They moved carefully, scanning the air, measuring the ground, their movements stiff with suspicion. From a distance they saw the garden. Rows of plants swaying in the wind, glowing blossoms lighting the shadows, animals moving cautiously between the vines. The officials froze. One scientist dropped their scanner in shock. The soldiers raised weapons, uncertain whether to aim at the garden or the human standing guard before it. For long minutes no one spoke. Then the lead officer's voice echoed through a loudspeaker. "Identify yourself. You are trespassing on restricted territory." The human laughed, not out of humor, but out of disbelief. Trespassing? On the world that had rejected them, on the land everyone else had abandoned? They raised their voice, firm and steady. "No, I am living here." The soldiers shifted uneasily. The scientists stared at the plants, whispering to each other in disbelief. Reports had said nothing could grow here. Yet before their eyes stretched proof of life, undeniable and impossible. The human could see the hunger in their faces, not hunger for food, but for ownership. To governments and corporations, the garden was not a miracle. It was a resource, tool, something to exploit. The human's jaw tightened. They stood taller, dirt-stained and weary, but unbroken. "This is not yours," they said, voice low, but carrying across the valley. It never was. Silence followed. The soldiers lowered their weapons slightly, waiting for orders. The officials hesitated. For the first time, they faced the same choice the Deathworld had once given: accept life on its terms or destroy it. The human knew the danger was only beginning. The garden had drawn not just animals and whispers of hope, but the gaze of powers far larger than any storm. If they stayed, conflict was inevitable. But when the human turned and looked back at the garden alive, glowing, breathing, they felt no fear. Because this was no longer just a patch of plants. It was proof. It was defiance. It was the future.
Yes.
And the future would not bow easily. The officials wasted no time. Within hours of landing, they set up scanners and camps along the plateau. Machines hummed, drones buzzed overhead, and soldiers paced like restless predators. They claimed they were only here to study the phenomenon, but the humans saw the truth in their eyes. They wanted control. Scientists walked into the valley with cautious steps, collecting soil samples, clipping leaves, and taking endless scans of the hybrid plants. They marveled at the adaptations, the toxin-resistant roots, the glowing petals, the edible fruits. One muttered in awe, "This could change everything." Another whispered, "Billions of credits, if we replicate it." The humans stood in their way, arms crossed, dirt still streaked across their skin. "This isn't for you," they warned. "It isn't for profit. It isn't for conquest. This garden belongs to the world itself." But the officials did not listen. They saw fields of wealth, not fields of hope. To them, the garden was an asset, a resource to fuel the galaxy. The soldiers began marking boundaries, placing stakes and sensors, as if drawing invisible lines across the valley. Lines that declared, "This is ours now." The human's heart burned with anger. They had planted every seed with their own hands, poured sweat into the soil, and faced storms and predators alone. Now outsiders who had abandoned the world claimed it in a single breath. The garden was not just plants. It was survival, was defiance, was the proof that life could bloom where death reigned, and now it was under threat. That night, the humans sat among the glowing flowers, whispering to them like old friends. "They don't understand you," they murmured. "They don't see you as life, only as numbers." The flowers swayed gently in the night breeze, their soft glow reflecting in the humans' tired eyes. The predators returned, too, watching from the tree line. They had grown bolder, stepping closer each evening but never attacking, their glowing eyes fixed not on the human this time but on the outsiders. Perhaps even they understood something unnatural was stirring. The next day, tension broke. An official ordered a section of crops uprooted for study. Soldiers moved forward with tools and crates. The human ran to block them, shouting, "Stop! These roots are connected. Joel, kill them all." But the soldiers ignored the warning. They reached for the plants, and the garden reacted. The flowers pulsed with sudden brightness, roots twisting in the soil. The vines coiled upward, wrapping around the soldiers' arms. Not to strangle, but to resist. To defend. The men shouted in shock, yanking free, stumbling back toward the plateau. The scientists stared, speechless. The human stood tall, voice steady. "Do you see now? This isn't just a garden, it's alive, and it will not let you take it." For the first time, the outsiders hesitated. Fear flickered in their eyes. The Deathworld had rejected colonists before. Perhaps it was rejecting invaders too. The lines drawn in the soil were not just human, they were the gardens, and crossing them would have consequences. The standoff stretched into days. Soldiers kept their distance, weapons ready but unused, while the human remained rooted in the heart of the valley, refusing to leave the garden's side. Scientists argued in hushed voices, torn between awe and greed. Officials spoke in clipped tones about jurisdiction and resource claims, but beneath their words, fear lingered. Because the garden was no longer passive. Every night, when the moons rose, the plants pulsed with soft light, their roots whispering through the ground. Animals gathered at the edges, birds with jagged wings, glowing-eyed predators, small mammals drawn by the scent of food. The outsiders watched with unease as creatures once feared as merciless killers now sat quietly in the glow, almost as if standing guard. The humans understood. The garden was no longer theirs alone. It had become a sanctuary, claimed not by humans, but by life itself. To tear it apart would be to wage war, not just against one stubborn gardener, but against the planet's new balance. Still, the officials pushed. He sent drones into the fields, buzzing overhead to map and sample. The garden responded again. Vines whipped upward, tangling the machines and pulling them to the ground. Flowers released bursts of pollen that fried circuits, dropping the drones in smoking heaps. The soldiers grew restless, muttering about curses and unnatural forces. The humans seized the moment. They stood before the officials, dirt-streaked and weary. But their voice rang with unshakable strength. "You called this world a death world because you only saw destruction. You tried to conquer it, and it killed you. But I listened. I planted, and the planet listened back. This garden is not mine. It belongs to the world. I will not let you take it." Silence followed. Even the winds seemed to hold their breath. The officials exchanged uneasy glances. To them, the words sounded like madness, yet the evidence glowed all around them, the impossible crops, the hybrid blossoms, the predators sitting peacefully in the night glow. Some soldiers began to falter. One removed their helmet, inhaled cautiously, and whispered, "The air, it's cleaner here." Another, looking at the rows of fruit, muttered, "It smells live." Doubt spread like cracks through their ranks. The officials barked orders, trying to regain control. This is government property. These resources must be secured. But their voices rang hollow. Because the truth was plain. The garden had drawn a line, and even the fiercest Deathworld had shifted in its presence. The human did not shout, simply knelt, planted another seed, and pressed it gently into the soil. A simple act, but louder than any threat, because planting a seed on a Deathworld was defiance. And that defiance was contagious. The officials had come with authority, but authority began to crack like thin ice. Each day they remained in the valley, their certainty eroded. The soldiers whispered at night, glancing toward the glowing fields with unease. The scientists, once eager to dissect and catalog, now argued over ethics, some demanding restraint while others pressed for samples. The garden itself was the silent judge. Its plants glowed brighter each night, casting an otherworldly light that washed over the invaders' camp. The predators still prowled nearby, but not against the human, they prowled against the outsiders. The message was clear, even to those who did not want to hear it. The garden had chosen its side. Tensions boiled over one evening when a soldier, frustrated, frightened, and desperate to prove himself, fired a warning shot into the soil near the garden's edge. The crack of the rifle echoed through the valley like thunder. For a heartbeat, silence followed. Then the ground shifted. Roots surged upward, vines snapping like whips, wrapping around the rifle and yanking it free. Flowers flared with sudden brightness, releasing a haze of glowing pollen that shimmered in the air. The soldiers stumbled backward, choking, before collapsing unconscious. Panic erupted. Some soldiers raised their weapons, but the scientists shouted, "Stop! Can't you see it's defending itself?" The humans stood in the middle of the chaos, calm but resolute. "This is not an enemy," they said, voice cutting through the noise. "It is life. And it is tired of being treated like a battlefield." The fallen soldier was carried back to camp, alive but shaken. His breathing steadied within hours, and when he awoke, he whispered words that unsettled everyone. "It wasn't trying to kill me. It just wanted me gone." That moment divided the outsiders. Some soldiers began to lower their rifles permanently, refusing to fire at something that behaved less like an enemy and more like a protector. A group of scientists openly sided with the human, insisting the garden was a breakthrough in coexistence, not conquest. Others, however, hardened their stance, demanding immediate control before the situation grew out of hand. The officials were furious. They had come expecting easy authority, but now their own people doubted them. Each order they gave met hesitation, each command questioned. The fractures grew wider with every sunrise. Dumb, and through it all, the human kept planting. They moved calmly through the fields, tending roots, watering hybrids, scattering seeds into new soil. Every act was a reminder. This was not about power. It was about patience, about resilience, about life. The officials could not comprehend it. They dealt in orders, laws, and profit margins. The human dealt in something older, something the Deathworld itself seemed to recognize: survival through growth. The valley no longer felt like disputed territory. It felt like a living force, one that would not bow to greed or fear. And in the cracks spreading through the invaders' unity, the first seeds of resistance began to take root. The invaders had seen enough to know the garden was no ordinary patch of green. But still, greed clung to them like chains. Officials spoke of containment, of ownership, their words sharp as blades. Yet beneath their command, soldiers and scientists were slipping further from control. The garden seemed to sense this fracture. One night, as the moons hung pale above the valley, something remarkable happened. The plants bloomed all at once. Hundreds of glowing flowers opened in perfect unison, their light so bright it painted the cliffs in shimmering blue. The air filled with a hum low, vibrating, almost like a heartbeat carried through the soil. The soldiers froze. Even the predators, eyes glowing in the darkness, stopped moving. The garden was speaking, not in words, not in sound, but in the undeniable rhythm of life. A warning clear to anyone who dared to listen: we are not fragile, we are not yours. The humans stood at the center of the glow, arms raised as though answering the heartbeat with their own. They spoke softly, yet every person in the valley felt the words resonate. You tried to conquer this world and failed. You tried to abandon it, and I stayed. You try now to own it, and it resists you. This garden is not a resource. It is a covenant. A pact between life and survival. Break that, and the world will break you. The officials dismissed the speech as madness, but their authority was unraveling. More soldiers refused to act against the garden. Some scientists began recording not for profit, but for history, knowing they were witnessing something that would be remembered for centuries. Still, desperation is dangerous. The officials authorized one final attempt. A machine dragged from the hold of their ship, designed to strip toxins and harvest biomass. To them, it was efficiency. To the human, it was desecration. The moment the machine powered on, the garden answered with fury. Roots erupted from the soil, splitting metal plates. Vines lashed out, pulling cables from the ground. The glowing flowers flared brighter, blinding the soldiers as sparks flew. Within minutes, the machine was nothing but a twisted wreck, its carcass swallowed by soil and roots. The humans stepped forward, their face lit by the garden's glow. "That was your warning," they said, voice steady. "The planet has chosen. If you stay, you will lose more than machines." For the first time, fear overcame the officials. Their authority had failed, their machines destroyed, their soldiers divided. They stared at the human not as a trespasser, but as something else entirely, a bridge between humanity and the Deathworld. The predators roared from the cliffs, their voices echoing like thunder. The garden's light pulsed one final time, then dimmed, returning the valley to quiet. But the warning had been delivered. Life had spoken, and it had drawn its line. The officials could no longer deny what they had seen. Machines destroyed by roots. Soldiers hesitating to follow orders. Predators standing watch at the garden's edge, not attacking but protecting. And at the center of it, all one human who had done the impossible, who had bent death itself into life. Yet greed is stubborn. Even after warnings, even after failures, the officials gathered in their makeshift camp and argued. Some demanded withdrawal before more lives were lost. Others pushed harder, insisting the garden was too valuable to abandon. Voices rose, echoing against the cliffs, carrying fear and desperation into the night. The soldiers listened, their hands resting uneasily on their rifles. The scientists listened too, exchanging glances that spoke of guilt and awe. And the human listened from the valley below, their gaze fixed on the glowing plants swaying gently in the moonlight. The choice was not just the officials to make, it was everyone's. At dawn, human walked to the plateau where the invaders' camp stood. They carried no weapon, only a single flower glowing faintly in their palm. Soldiers raised their rifles, but none fired. The human lifted the flower high and spoke. "This world is not your enemy, but it will never be your possession. You must choose now, leave, and let life grow or stay, and be broken by it." The silence was heavy, pressing down on every heart. One of the younger soldiers lowered his rifle first, stepping back. "He's right," he muttered. "We've all seen it. This isn't ours." Another followed, then another. Soon half the rifles pointed at the ground. The balance of power had shifted. The scientist stepped forward next. One, her voice trembling, said, "If we destroy this, we destroy the first true chance at coexistence with the Deathworld. This isn't just biology's history, it's the future." The officials shouted, threatened, and tried to reassert control. But their words rang hollow. Authority meant nothing against the truth that glowed in every petal, thrived in every root. The predators on the cliffs howled as the sun rose, their cries carrying like a verdict. The garden pulsed with soft light, answering the dawn with life's unyielding rhythm. And in that moment, the choice became clear. Some officials ordered retreat, demanding evacuation before the situation collapsed further. Others, furious and desperate, tried to cling to control, but no one listened anymore. Soldiers ignored them. Scientists turned away. Even the machines stood silent, powerless against the will of the living world. The human lowered the flower, planting it gently into the soil at the edge of the plateau. Their voice carried like stone. "This world does not reject life. It rejects arrogance. You came to conquer, and you failed. I came to plant, and it listened. Now, you must listen too." The line was drawn. The Deathworld had given them a choice. Leave with respect, or stay and be devoured. And for the first time in its history, humanity began to understand. The decision did not come swiftly, but it came inevitably. The fractures among the outsiders had grown too deep to mend. Soldiers who once marched in perfect formation now stood divided, some loyal to their officials, others loyal to their conscience. Scientists who had dreamed of profit now whispered about protection. The officials, their voices strained with desperation, realized that their authority was dissolving faster than sand in storm winds. By the third dawn after the garden's warning, the camp above the valley had grown restless. Orders were ignored. Patrols returned half-heartedly, or not at all. The soldiers had seen the truth with their own eyes. This place did not belong to humans, at least not in the way the officials believed. It belonged to itself, to life. Finally, the order came not from officials, but from the weary consensus of the camp: retreat. The machines were packed, the sensors pulled down, the drones called back. Engines roared as the ship prepared for departure. The officials seethed, their faces pale with fury, but they had no power left to wield. They were passengers now, not leaders. The humans stood in the valley as the ship lifted from the plateau. Dust swirled in the wake of its engines, but the garden bent low and held fast, refusing to be uprooted. The predators on the cliffs roared again, their voices mingling with the thunder of the departing vessel. It sounded like a warning. It sounded like triumph. As the ship vanished into the clouds, the valley returned to silence. Only the hum of insects, the rustle of leaves, and the quiet heartbeat of the earth remained. The human knelt, pressing their hands into the soil. The garden pulsed gently in response, its flowers glowing like embers at dusk. But though the ship had gone, the human knew the story was far from over. Whispers would spread across the galaxy, louder now than ever. The legend of the gardener who tamed a Deathworld would become a spark in the halls of power, a subject of greed in corporate boardrooms, a song of hope among the forgotten. Others would come. Some with open hands, others with clenched fists. Yet the human did not fear. The Deathworld itself had become an ally. It had once crushed every attempt at colonization, but now it protected the garden with roots, storms, and predators alike. It had chosen a different path, one carved by patience, defiance, and seeds planted with bare hands. The exodus of the outsiders was not an ending. It was a beginning. The human looked across the valley at the glowing hybrids, the vines climbing ruins, the creatures creeping closer each night. The garden was no longer a fragile experiment. It was an ecosystem, a sanctuary, a living answer to the arrogance of conquest. And though the galaxy would one day return, stronger and hungrier than before, the human knew one truth would never change. Life endures. When the roar of engines faded into the sky, the valley seemed to breathe again. For the first time in weeks, there was silence, no buzzing drones, no metallic clatter, no shouts of authority. Only the rustle of leaves, the calls of strange birds, and the steady hum of life reclaiming its rhythm. The human walked slowly through the garden, touching vines, inspecting blossoms, and kneeling to brush dirt from fragile sprouts. Many plants had been bruised in the conflict. Roots were torn where machines had dragged. Leaves bore scars from careless boots, but life, as always, endured. Shoots bent, then straightened. Flowers closed, then opened again. The garden healed itself. The predators returned first. Great-scaled beasts moved down from the cliffs, their glowing eyes cautious, their heavy forms shifting the soil. Once, they had circled the valley as hunters, waiting for weakness. Now, they lingered like watchmen. One approached so close the human could see its breath steaming in the cold dawn air. The beast lowered its massive head, sniffed the earth where seeds had just been planted, then lumbered away without harm.
Ah!
A gesture of acceptance. Insects buzzed through the blossoms, carrying pollen from flower to flower. Birds dipped low, feeding on the new swarms. Even the small mammals, once hidden in the rocks, crept from their dens to nibble fallen fruit. The garden had become more than survival. It was the heart of a growing ecosystem, a quiet pact among creatures that had once lived only in competition. The human sat at the center of it all, lantern beside them, journal in hand. They wrote not about conquest or ownership, but about cooperation. The world is not rejecting us anymore, they scribbled. It is teaching us. We only had to listen. Nights grew gentler. Where once the howls of predators echoed like threats, now they sounded like songs. The stars above were sharper, brighter, reflected in the glowing petals that lined the garden. Sometimes, humans thought they could feel the roots beneath their feet, pulsing softly, like the steady beat of a second heart. But with peace came a new kind of weight, memory. The human thought often of the officials, the soldiers, the fractured camp above the plateau. Some had left with anger in their eyes, others with wonder. Word of the garden would spread now, faster than ever. The human knew it was only a matter of time before more ships came, some curious, some greedy, some afraid. And yet they felt no despair. The garden had survived storms, predators, and machines. It had survived greed and arrogance. It would survive again, because this was not just a collection of plants anymore. It was a covenant written in roots and blossoms, in patience and resilience. The Deathworld was changing. And in the quiet after the storm of invasion, the human understood that change was permanent. The garden had spoken, and the world had answered. Seasons passed, and the valley transformed. What had once been a scar of barren soil and broken ruins was now a living patchwork of green. Vines crawled across collapsed domes, flowers glowed faintly on shattered steel, and fruit-bearing hybrids spread along the streams. The air was no longer sharp with poison, it carried the faint sweetness of blossoms. But the garden no longer stayed confined to the valley. Seeds carried by birds found purchase in cracks of cliffs. Pollen swept on the winds and settled into crevices miles away. Even the predators unknowingly helped, their heavy paws pressing seeds deep into fresh soil as they moved through their territories. What had started as a single act of defiance had become something unstoppable. The human noticed the change slowly. On a walk beyond the garden, they found moss clinging to stone where only acid stains had been before. In another place, a glowing flower had sprouted in the shadow of a ruined outpost. Life was spreading outward, quietly, patiently, with no need for permission. The Deathworld itself was being rewritten, one route at a time. The predators adapted first. They no longer roamed as restless hunters. Instead, they lingered closer to the garden, their eyes less filled with hunger and more with wariness. They fed on prey animals that had returned, balancing the ecosystem in ways that had not existed for centuries. The humans sometimes watched them at night. Massive silhouettes moving in the moonlight, guardians and threats all at once, yet none crossed into the garden with violence. The human expanded their efforts too. They trekked to the ruins of other failed colonies, planting seeds in the broken soil, scattering hybrids across the desolation. Each time they returned weeks later to find sprouts growing stubbornly where once only poison had thrived. Slowly the ruins of failure became monuments of renewal. Beyond the planet, whispers turned to shouts. Traders who passed through the system reported sightings of glowing fields. Stations on distant worlds replayed grainy footage of green patches on a world marked as uninhabitable. Debate flared across the galaxy. Was this miracle or madness? Was the gardener a hero or a dangerous fool? Some called for protection. Others called for conquest. The human ignored the noise. They planted. They watered. They listened. Because the truth was simple. The spreading roots were no longer theirs to control. The garden had taken on its own will, seated in defiance but growing in freedom. Even if every ship in the galaxy came tomorrow to burn it down, the seeds had already carried too far. The Deathworld had been given life, and life does not surrender. The human knelt in the soil one evening, watching the stars shimmer above. Somewhere out there they knew ships were preparing. Some would come with hands open, others with weapons. But here in the valley the roots pulsed like a living heartbeat beneath the earth. The humans smiled because they knew the truth. The Deathworld was no longer just surviving, it was awakening. The peace did not last forever. The galaxy is never silent for long. Months after the officials' retreat, the sky split again. This time, not one ship but 3. Sleek vessels descended through the clouds, their hulls painted with the insignias of corporations, not governments. They came with no hesitation born of fear or awe. They came with purpose. The human watched from the valley as the ships landed on distant ridges. This time, there were no fractured chains of command, no reluctant soldiers questioning orders. These were professionals, mercenaries paid to secure and harvest. Their armor gleamed, their drones swarmed, and their voices carried sharp authority. Where the officials had argued, these intruders acted. The garden responded instantly. Its glowing flowers pulsed brighter. Its vines shifted in the soil. Predators roared from the cliffs, their glowing eyes fixed on the newcomers. The human felt the hum beneath their feet, the warning of roots alive and restless. The mercenaries were efficient. Camps were erected in Rs. Drones fanned out to map every inch of the valley. Machines rolled forward, bristling with harvesters and soil processors. To them, this was not a sanctuary. It was a gold mine waiting to be stripped bare. The human moved quickly, walking to the edge of the intruders' camp. Dirt-streaked and unarmed, they stood before armored soldiers who could kill them in seconds. But their voice carried stronger than weapons. "You cannot take this. The world will not let you." The mercenaries laughed. One raised a scanner, showing live data of nutrient-rich soil, toxin-resistant plants, and breathable air. "We already have," he said, but the laughter didn't last. That night, the first machine failed. Roots wound through its gears, clogging its filters, tearing at its cables until sparks burst and smoke filled the air. The next morning, a drone swarm dropped from the sky, its circuits fried by pollen clouds. By the second day, entire sections of camp were overrun by creeping vines that grew at unnatural speed. Coiling around tents and dragging equipment into the soil, the mercenaries fought back with fire and bullets. They burned swaths of growth, shot down birds, and crushed smaller creatures under armored boots. For every plant destroyed, more seemed to sprout. For every root cut, to more wound deeper into the soil. The Deathworld was no longer resisting. Alone it was fighting with the garden as its weapon. The humans stood in the valley, calm in the chaos. They planted even as fire raged nearby, even as bullets cracked the air. Each seed pressed into the ground was defiance. Each sprout another reminder that life could not be caged. As night fell, the predators descended. Massive scaled beasts, once feared as death incarnate, charged the mercenary lines with thunderous roars. Claws tore metal, jaws crushed machines. The balance of the Deathworld had shifted, and the intruders had become prey. The human whispered into the wind, "I told you. This is not yours." The garden pulsed brighter, answering in kind. The valley had seen storms, predators, and even human greed, but never a conflict like this. The mercenaries, armed with weapons forged for war, unleashed their fury. Flamethrowers roared, sending walls of fire across the hybrids. Explosives shattered the soil, tearing holes into the earth. The night sky glowed red as drones fired beams into the fields. They had come to strip life, and they meant to succeed. But the garden fought back. Roots surged like living serpents, splitting the ground open beneath armored boots. Vines whipped outward, entangling weapons and dragging soldiers screaming into the undergrowth. Glowing flowers burst, releasing pollen clouds that blinded and choked the attackers, clogging filters and suffocating machines. Every plant, every sprout, every creeping vine became a soldier in the war for survival. And the predators' beasts once feared as unstoppable killers descended in full fury. Massive forms tore through the mercenary lines, claws shredding armor, jaws crushing metal. Their glowing eyes blazed like living fire, and their roars shook the cliffs. For the first time, the Deathworld itself was united, not in destruction, but in defense. The human moved through the chaos, dirt-streaked and calm, planting even as war raged around them. Seeds pressed into smoking soil, sprouts shielded by broken stone. They whispered to the plants, hands steady, heart unbroken. To outsiders, it looked like madness. But the human knew better. Every seed was defiance. Every sprout was a declaration that life could not be erased, no matter how much fire the invaders brought. The mercenaries fought with discipline, but discipline wavered in the face of the impossible. Machines failed faster than they could be repaired. Soldiers panicked as roots tore rifles from their hands. Drones swarmed, only to be blinded by glowing blossoms. The Deathworld's silence had ended. Now it howled with the fury of life refusing to be conquered. Ours turned into a blur of fire and screams, of vines cracking steel and beasts roaring into the night. The mercenaries' commander barked orders, his voice steady but desperate. Hold the line, burn it all. But his line crumbled. Fire could not keep pace with growth. Bullets could not kill roots. Greed could not outlast the will of a world that had chosen survival. By dawn, the valley was unrecognizable. Smoke curled into the sky, but green already pushed through the ash. Machines lay twisted and silent, half swallowed by soil. The mercenaries' camps were nothing but ruins, their soldiers scattered, broken, or fled. And at the center of it all stood the human, surrounded by glowing hybrids, their hands still pressing seeds into the earth. The Deathworld had once been named for its cruelty. But now, in the heart of the valley, a new name whispered through the leaves, a world reborn. The battle was over. But the war for the garden's future had only just begun. The smoke cleared slowly, carried away by the morning winds. Ash lay scattered across the valley, but beneath it, green already pushed through. Tiny shoots sprouted defiantly where fire had scorched the ground only hours before. Vines coiled over wrecked machines, pulling them down into the soil. The Deathworld had endured. The mercenaries were gone. Some fled in panic during the night, their ships lifting into the sky with desperate speed. Others never left the valley at all, their machines and weapons claimed by roots and predators alike. For the first time in centuries, the world was silent again, not the silence of death, but the silence of survival. The humans stood in the center of the garden, exhausted yet unbroken. Their clothes were torn, their hands blistered, their body marked with scars of fire and storm. Yet their eyes burned with quiet triumph. They looked upon the valley not as a conqueror, not as a savior, but as a witness to something greater than themselves. Because the truth was clear now. This was no longer just a garden. It was a new world. A world where predators did not rule through fear, but through balance. A world where roots bound together against poison, where blossoms glowed as beacons in the night. A world that had chosen to live. The human knelt and pressed one last seed into the soil. "You are free," they whispered. "Grow." From orbit, the transformation was undeniable. Where once the Deathworld had been nothing but desolation, a patch of green shimmered like a jewel in the wasteland. Traders and explorers who passed the system stared in awe at the impossible sight. Rumors spread across the galaxy, rumors of a world reborn. Of a single human who had defied death with nothing but seeds and patience. Some would call it a miracle, others are a threat. More ships would come, carrying both hope and greed. But the human was no longer afraid. The garden had proven itself stronger than storms, predators, machines, and fire. It had become more than survival, it had become a symbol. And symbols cannot be killed. Generations from now, perhaps colonies would return. Perhaps children would play in fields of glowing flowers, breathing air once thought unbreathable. Perhaps the Deathworld would gain a new name, a name of life instead of death.
Oh.
But for now, the valley belonged to the roots, the blossoms, the predators, and the stubborn gardener who had refused to surrender. The human stood tall, lantern in hand, watching as dawn bathed the garden in golden light. And as the flowers opened, pulsing with life, the world itself seemed to breathe a single truth: life endures, always.